Welcome to another in the Workforce Education webcast series presented by the National Dissemination Center for Career and Technical Education. I'm Morgan Lewis. We are happy to welcome to the National Dissemination Center today the director of our companion center, the National Research Center for Career and Technical Education, Dr. James Stone. Dr. Stone is going to be talking on a topic of great interest to all of us in career and technical education, increasing the math skills of CTE students. He is going to be reporting on a number of studies, which are a set of studies which are being conducted by the National Research Center, which are based on a basic principle that virtually all educators would agree with. And that principle is that students learn better material which is relevant and useful to their lives. The studies which Dr. Stone is going to speak about have been examining that basic principle, one in a very rigorous experimental test to see if there is evidence which supports that principle. Those of you who are watching on this webcast, we hope that you will join the chat room and through that chat room submit questions for Dr. Stone, which he will respond to after his formal presentation. Jim?
Thank you, Dr. Morgan. And thank all of you who are watching this today, and my thanks also to the National Dissemination Center for hosting this. I've entitled this presentation, Increasing the Math Skills of CTE Students, and we'll get into why that's important. But I want to pull from a variety of sources in order to examine this question. My agenda is to spend just a moment talking about probably what is obvious to all of us, and that is the importance of enhancing the math skills. And then I want to talk about findings from a study that's going on currently through the National Center, actually 3 studies going on through the National Center at the moment, and also findings from the NAVE and other federal studies that have been recently concluded. This is a presentation. The center itself and the work of the center is supported by the U.S. Department of Education and the Office of Vocational Adult Education. But it is important to acknowledge that the contents do not necessarily represent the positions or policies of these funding agencies. Why math? Well, there are a number of reasons, and I think most of you are probably familiar with these. The National Council of Teachers of Mathematics has emphasized the importance of mathematics as a new basics for industry. And I think industry leaders in a number of reports, including those from the National Association of Manufacturers and others, have emphasized this. That there is a degree of mathematical literacy that's necessary for virtually all important occupations, and by that I mean occupations that have some potential for earnings as well as occupations that have potential for advancement. We also know from a number of studies that American students, especially at the high school level, tend to lag behind our international competitors. And finally, in order to compete in this global marketplace, future workers have to be as literate in mathematics as they are in other areas. Brief word from our sponsor. The National Center is part of a consortium that includes the Ohio State University, the Oregon State University, Penn State, Johns Hopkins University, the Academy for Education Development. It is from these various institutions that we draw the people who do the work of the centers. Just a brief word about a couple of current studies in the National Center. The Math and CTE study I will be talking about at greater length, so I'll skip that one at the moment. But we're also involved in a study right now that is analyzing a current national data set called the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth of 1997. Looking at questions that were visited by the NAVE and other recent studies, but using data that are more current, dealing with students who graduated in the late 1990s and early 2000. We also have a longitudinal study, shorthand title is What Works. This is a study that, among other things, is examining mathematic achievement of students in 3 different kinds of high poverty communities. And then finally, we have the Transition Network study, which is a study looking at strategies for successfully helping young people move from high school to post-secondary technical education. More about those studies can be found on our website. And finally, the newest study that we've added that we're in the midst of right now is a study that's looking at student, career, and technical organizations, and we're looking at the question of the value added of these experiences. Let us begin by trying to frame the problem of math in terms of what we know historically and where we are today. The National Assessment of Educational Progress has regularly measured the math skills of 17-year-olds beginning as far back as 1973. You can tell from this graphic that the average scores on this 500-point exam have remained essentially unchanged during that time period. They've gone up a little, they've gone down a little, but essentially unchanged. And I think this is graphic illustration of the dilemma that we face as we try to increase the math skills of our students. This lack of progress, at least on this one measure of math skill, comes despite the fact that across the United States today, students are taking more academic coursework than ever before. Since the early 1980s, on average, students are taking an additional 4 Carnegie units of coursework. Almost all of that, virtually all of that, is in math and science. But again, what the NAEP scores would suggest that adding more coursework does not seem to be having an impact. One explanation perhaps is offered by Calvin, and I don't know if this is it, but if you've ever proctored an exam of 17-year-olds, I think you certainly have seen Calvin's attitude at work. But you can't make me care. Rumor has it she's up to 2 packs a day unfiltered. Calvin I often turn to when I'm looking for simple ways of understanding complex human phenomena. So here's our challenge. There's little math beyond 10th grade. Students, although this is changing as states increase math requirements, students generally stop taking math when they've met their minimal requirement. We know, however, that virtually all students in high school take some career technical education coursework, and a substantial percentage of them take 3 or more credits in an area that's defined as specific labor market preparation. Those are programs like carpentry, auto technology, health occupations, business marketing, and others that have a direct connection to the labor market. And these primarily are taken by students in 11th and 12th grade after they have finished taking what math they intend to take. We also know that most students, not just CTE students, but most students do poorly on math exams, especially those that are necessary for placement into 2-year colleges. We also know that the context of career and technical education coursework is rich in mathematics, but that the curriculum, the pedagogies that we have in place, generally speaking, do not systematically emphasize this skill development in this important area. These are 4 recent studies that I want to briefly visit before we talk about the math and CTE study in more detail. The first study I want to briefly mention is one that is a 5-year longitudinal study. It's entitled, the shorthand title was What Works, but it's really a study of career and technical education-based whole school reform. And we're looking at specifically career academies, career pathways, and vocational high school that has implemented a high schools that work effort. And we're looking in this study, we're looking at many things, but for today's discussion, I just want to highlight one aspect of the data that we've collected, and that's focusing on math difficulty and math progression. What we find, just a bit more on the sites, these are 3 high poverty communities with a large percentage of second language learners. They were specifically chosen for these characteristics. And we're looking again at one school that is a wall-to-wall academy school, a second that has implemented career pathways and all students participate, and again a third is a vocational high school that uses high schools at work as a basis for its reform. It's a 5-year longitudinal study. We initially started with groups of 7th graders, 9th graders, and 11th graders. We have continued to follow them for 5 years. Among the many questions that we're following are the degree of math difficulty and their progression in math sequences. What we find is that, especially at the academy and pathway high schools, the findings are very clear and very positive. That is to say that students in these particular settings are taking more mathematics, they're sticking with it longer, and they're more likely to successfully complete the sequence. At the vocational high school, the findings are neutral in the sense that they are no different, neither better nor worse than 2 comparison schools. But this particular school has a great deal of input disparities. That is to say that their entering 9th grade class is overrepresented by special education students and other students who experience difficulty in the regular education system. So despite that, one could argue they're holding their own. We find strong differences in math in 11th and 12th grade in this vocational high school, And in all three sites, we find that students are making better progress toward graduation than in the comparison schools. We've also been analyzing, as I mentioned, student reports from the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth of 1997. And one of the comparisons that we have been making in this analysis is looking at students who are identified as career tech ed students by their own definition, and students who are identified as what we might call general concentration, general track, but they're neither in the college preparatory program nor in a vocational or CTE preparatory program. Essentially no concentration. And we do these comparisons because entering high school, these two groups of students tend to look alike on academic measures. And what we find when we look just at the question of mathematics, we find that the career and technical education students, a higher proportion of them are taking geometry, algebra 2, trig calc, and other advanced mathematics than are their counterparts, and they're less likely to be taking general or basic or algebra 1. Again, an indication in the late 1990s of some changes that had been occurring in the adding rigor to the programs of career and tech ed high school students. Now, two sets of federal findings I want to point to just quickly. The recent NAEB that was published in 2004 pointed out that CTE students, when compared to all others, including the academic preparatory students and others within the high school, have made quite dramatic changes in terms of the proportion of them who are meeting minimal requirements for mathematics in terms of test scores. This is in part, I think, a function of what this other data showed from a different data source, and that is that CTE students are proportionally taking fewer low-level and low mid-level math and are increasingly taking upper math and advanced mathematics. I think this is part of that explanation. However, we know that despite this strong growth in the latter part of the 1990s, students who are identified as career and technical education majors still lag other students in terms of overall math proficiency, but there has been a dramatic gain in a relatively short period of time. I think what that presents to us is a picture of a challenge, and I identify that challenge as maintaining the career development rigor that we have shown to be effective and as a benefit for students in career and technical education, while at the same time increasing the academic rigor in our programs. There are a number of reasons why we could argue that we ought to be doing this. First and foremost, perhaps, is the Perkins Accountability Core Indicator number 1, which calls for students, career and technical education majors or students in high school, to increase not only their technical achievement, but also academic achievement. The No Child Left Behind, I think, has laid out a framework essentially for K-8, but certainly it holds for the high school students as well, that is putting increased pressure on students to be able to perform academically. I think we have a sufficient amount of evidence that industry is certainly demanding students who have greater levels of numeracy than we've had needed in the past. And finally, I would make what I call a moral argument. I think we can and we should focus on increasing the academic rigor of programs that our students are engaged in. We need to do this because if we are, in fact, providing students opportunities to begin a career pathway, a career direction, it's absolutely vital that these students be adequately prepared for the workplace that they're going to be moving into. Certainly, a part of this preparation is the understanding of the industry, the technical skills necessary to be successful in that industry, but also the grounding in the academics of math and science, especially so that they're able to deal with the technology that they encounter and to deal with the changing workplace as it continues to evolve at an ever rapid pace. There have been, over the years, a number of alternative strategies that have been used to try to focus career and tech ed students in high school in terms of improving their math skills. There have been and continue to be a number of related math classes. Now, this typology is my definition. Others may have another definition, but in my looking at career and tech ed over the last 20 years, they seem to fall out into these categories. Business math would be an example of this, and we see this still frequently in many high schools. There are others, and these are not mutually exclusive categories, but applied math classes. For example, tech prep math you find in some high schools, with the idea of teaching the mathematics in the context somewhat generically of work and occupations, but not specific to any particular area. We also find examples of what I call pull-out math classes, where there's a vocational or career tech ed program, and on Tuesdays and Thursdays, a math teacher might come in and the students will often physically shift to a different location. Maybe it's a classroom built inside the larger lab, and the math teacher will instruct math that is related, that is applied. We can use lots of vocabulary to describe it. Another model, and it's a variation on that theme, is that math teachers come in and perhaps team teach with the career tech ed instructor elements of math or units of math, but it is the math teacher who still is leading the math instruction. And the final model that I want to talk about for the rest of my time today is what I will simply call the National Research Center model. We took a look at all of these background characteristics of students who come into career tech ed programs. We looked at the literature. We talked to an awful lot of folks as we thought about where we needed to focus some of the energy of the center. And it became clear that helping CTE majors improve their math skills is a priority, if not the priority. And we designed a study that we really wanted to test the possibility that we can take the existing curriculum and take the existing career tech ed instructors and work with them to tweak the curriculum, to modify their pedagogies, or perhaps give them new ones, such that we could build skills in this critical area of mathematics, while at the same time not reducing the technical skill development, which data show are very important to young people for a lot of reasons, and many of those were addressed in the recent NAVE report. In putting this study together, we had a host of collaborators. We enlisted a lot of help from a lot of people to get this off the ground, from organizations to individuals. The individuals on the right-hand column, a number of them we turn to for advice on research design. We turn to others for help in identifying the content of vocational career tech ed and ways that we might think about interrogating that content to understand the math that's embedded in there. This project could not have been as successful as it has been thus far without the help of all of these individuals and organizations. We have really 4 questions of the study. The first question is if we tweak the curriculum, if we enhance it, if we take a look at the math that's there and do something with it, if we work with the CTE instructors and help them understand how to understand that math in different ways that they can help their students to understand that math, does it make a difference at all? The second question flows from the first. If we can make a difference, how much of a difference? How much can we pull out of a career tech ed curriculum in terms of the amount of mathematics that might be there? And the third question is, can we do it without reducing the technical skill development? And then the final question is, amongst all the things that we're doing, what is it that we can really point to that makes a difference? Really, what is it that we can say or answers the question of what works? Now, a few terms that I'll throw around periodically. By definition, the National Center on Educational Statistics tends to classify students into different categories for the purpose of analysis. Within the career tech ed area, we generally have 3 categories that are commonly associated with these kinds of analyses. One group of courses referred to as general labor market preparation. These are primarily focused on career development, programs or courses that are designed to help young people think about how to get a job and so forth. A second category are the family and consumer science courses that exist in our middle schools and high schools. And the third group are what are referred to as specific labor market prep, and I alluded to those earlier. These are the ones that have the direct connection to the workplace and to specific workplaces. And it is these that we use as the focus of this particular study. By way of a picture, this is what the study looks like. In putting this study together, we worked with many of those organizations I showed earlier in an earlier slide. And we solicited from them mailing lists. We sent out calls literally across the country asking for teachers to volunteer to be part of this study. We ultimately selected these initially 6 areas, but now 5 for the second year of the study, based on a couple of characteristics. One thing was, the first rule was we wanted to make sure that we had some idea or some assurance that the curriculum within any of these areas was essentially the same. And so that meant that for the most part we had to stay within state boundaries, because when you move from state to state, very often the curriculum changes, and sometimes changes quite dramatically. The second thing that we needed to have was a sufficient number of teachers then within any of those states within one or more specific labor market prep area. So despite the fact that we had many more applications from teachers that we wound up not being able to use for this study, we were able to build successful cohorts for analysis in these 5 areas. So we have through our partner at Penn State, we are looking at the auto technology program, and that actually does involve teachers and programs and students from more than one state. But because they are bound through the AYES curriculum, we have that consistency of curriculum, so we're able to do that. We're looking at business and marketing education in Colorado. We are looking at information technology, and that's being run through our partners at Ohio State University, primarily in Michigan, but also in Ohio. And in Oklahoma, we're working with the agricultural education unit there. And then finally, our health occupations replication site is in Michigan. For the second year of the study, we have approximately 3,000 students involved and a total of about 150 teachers. It's a substantial undertaking. And in terms of the design, what we're doing are actually 5 simultaneous replications of the same basic design in 5 different areas. Within each of those areas, as we built our pool of applicants, we then randomly assigned approximately 20 or so teachers to the experimental condition and 20 or so teachers who would be control teachers, in the sense that those teachers we asked to do nothing different than they would ordinarily do during the course of the study. The teachers who were randomly selected for the experimental side of the study then were those who worked with us in developing curriculum and pedagogic enhancements. This is our working hypothesis for the study. We think that that high school students who experience this kind of curricular and pedagogic intervention and enhancement will develop a deeper and more sustained understanding of mathematical concepts than those who participate in a traditional CTE curriculum. And by this we mean not only will they have a deeper and more sustained understanding, but they'll be able to transfer that understanding to a different, new, or perhaps novel setting. And of particular interest in this study, we want to know whether or not what they learn in the context of a career and tech ed program actually helps them understand mathematics when they see it on state tests or other sort of standardized instruments. In terms of how we're answering these key questions, we are looking first at the difference, just simple difference scores between the control and experimental groups on 3 types of math measures, and I'll talk about those in just a moment. The second question is whether or not we can infuse enough math into a CTE curriculum to meaningfully enhance it, because these interventions that we're experimenting with are time-consuming, they're expensive, and that if we're going to make this kind of investment, is it worth it? Or are we getting just a little bit of a nudge and there's not much meaningful change? And to look at that, we'll be examining gain scores this year, as well as comparing our students and what they're learning to national and state standards. And then finally, the question of what works, we'll be looking at a variety of qualitative and quantitative data, and I'll show you that in just a moment. But in terms of measuring math skill development, we have 3 global measures of math achievement. One is Terra Nova. They've been very helpful in working with us in developing instruments for this study. But they represent in this study the traditional math exam kind of questions. AccuPlacer is a widely used college placement exam, which allows us to say something about the extent to which whatever we're doing has an impact on lowering or reducing the remediation rates of students as they move on to post-secondary education. And the third is WorkKeys, which gives us an applied math approach. 3 different ways of looking at understanding math achievement. A second level of analysis that we will be working on is, besides these global measures, which our students are, these tests our students are taking, we'll be pulling items out of those that specifically relate to the enhancements that were the focus for each of parts of our study. And then finally, we're looking at technical skill development. We've been working with the folks at NRCCTE, AYES, and MarkEd, who all have been very helpful in crafting or adapting their skills tests to our study. In terms of answering the what works questions, again, we're looking here at a mixture of qualitative and quantitative. We will be spending time in classrooms. We are spending time in classrooms. We'll be doing surveys of teachers with open-ended questions. We have feedback mechanisms that are online that the teachers do on a regular basis. We have post-enhancement teacher feedback focus groups that we do. We'll be looking at samples of lesson plans, looking at samples of student work, all as strategies to try to help us understand what part of what we're doing really seems to make a difference in terms of student achievement. We'll also be using, we'll be quantifying some forms of classroom observations, some forms of teacher feedback, and we'll be quantifying some forms of our closed-ended student and teacher surveys. In the process of trying to understand what we're learning about the experimental teachers, we also have to pay attention to the teachers on the control side. One of the things that we knew going into this study is that because these are all volunteers, we were concerned that the teachers on the control side might just start talking a little bit more about mathematics in their classes because they're in a study that has to do with mathematics. So we need to monitor their behavior, if you will, during the course of this study. We also know that a lot of school districts and a lot of schools within school districts are developing their own interventions for math to enhance the math skills of students. So if we have, for some reason, some of our control schools who are implementing school-wide math efforts, at the same time we're trying to experiment with a specific kind of intervention, it's very possible that we would find something that's working over here but never know it because their math scores may go up as well because of something else unrelated to the study. So we have to monitor that, we have to measure that, and deal with that in our analysis. So that's all part of that overall, what we call fidelity of treatment set of measures. In terms of who's working with us, again, this is a very complex study. We are in well over 100 school districts across the United States. We're in about 9 states with those school districts. Within the schools, we have either an experimental or a control teacher, and these people are, for the most part, with a couple of exceptions, in different schools, and that was by design. On the experimental side, each experimental teacher in the study has a math teacher partner. In most cases, they're in the same school, but that's not always the case, especially if they're located in a regional vocational center of some sort. And then in both the experimental and control sides, we have a liaison who facilitates the testing and the collection of classroom artifacts. When we think about the process, we began by developing what we call, and others have called, curriculum maps, and I'll share with you an example of one of those in just a moment. We then have, in our pilot study, which we conducted last spring, we implemented a professional development sequence of events. One of the things we learned from last spring's work was that needed to be tweaked. And so we have an extended version of that. But that's a critical part. If you're going to ask teachers who are not mathematics teachers to deal with the mathematics that is embedded in their curriculum, then we have to give them the tools to do that. And that's part of our professional development. And then we have ongoing math support. Aside from helping teachers understand the math, we have to give them enough support themselves so they actually understand the math concepts they're working with in their classrooms. And so we built that into our study as well. And then finally, the process is the teaching of the enhanced CTE curriculum. In thinking about curriculum maps, we begin with the CTE content. The CTE content is the starting point. We look for the math that is there. And we did this in a number of ways. We started with work others had already done. VTEX, AYES, MarkEd, a number of states have developed guides. And so for each of these 5 areas, we took everything we could find and we sat down with the curriculum for that state. And we tried to match it up with these different kinds of curriculum maps and create a sort of a synthesized version. The teachers then, working with their math partners through professional development, took the initial maps that we created and further tweaked them. In some cases, they took some things out because they said they don't teach in that particular content area. In many other cases, they added additional math constructs that we had missed or that others had missed. And so that they created the final map that was really the beginning of this enhancement process. And then we had to align the map with the planned curriculum for the entire year and creating what we call a scope and sequence or planning grid. And here's a sample of a curriculum map for the ag mechanics. And what you see is on the left-hand side, you see the kinds of problem-solving applications that students in that particular program would experience. The second column over then, math content standards, is a framework that we use from a commercial test maker who produces a widely used test that states use for their required tests of students. The third column in this particular case are the standards that are set by the state. So we're looking to crosswalk it there, and then finally we crosswalk to the NCTM standards. So that we begin with the curriculum, and then we look for the math that's there, and then we crosswalk it to see where it plugs into various kinds of curriculum standards in mathematics. The other thing that we learned from our spring pilot study was we needed to make sure that teachers were implementing the curriculum at the time that they were supposed to be. One of the things that this study is predicated on is the idea that we're teaching math as it flows naturally from the curriculum. We're not trying to force the math into the curriculum, or we're not trying to add it on as another unit where on Fridays we do math. Rather, what we're doing, I've likened it to trying to infuse oil and water such that the volume of the container will not increase. And all of you who remember your physics know that that's impossible. But in a very real sense, that's what we're doing. One of the key concerns that was raised when we first began to put this study together, and I went around and talked to folks about this, was they said, well, if we spend more time teaching math, I'll have less time to spend on my content. And in order to get through my content standards for my career tech ed area, I can't take any time away. My argument was that the design that we had in mind would literally infuse it so that you're not taking time away from the content, but rather it becomes part of the natural discussion of that content. So that if you're in a construction class of some kind and you're talking about pitch on the roof, you can immediately also begin to talk to students about slope on a graph because they're exactly the same thing. And the calculations for the angles work the same way. So it was really an effort to make sure that we are teaching the math when it's supposed to be taught as it naturally flows from the curriculum. So this is just a partial of our rather complex planning grid. But for 2 weeks in September, for example, in our different sites, you can see that the different lesson plans that they developed with their codes of AT and AM and H and B and so forth, we know when they had planned to teach. And we also know how many teachers were involved in teaching those, because even though we're within states that have essentially the same curriculum, we did find that this school district might be here at that part of the curriculum, another school might be somewhere else. So that during the course of the year, they all would teach all of the concepts that we had identified, but not necessarily at the exact same time. This allows us to monitor progress. It allows us to make sure that the teachers, in fact, are staying on track with the enhancements and with the interventions themselves. Now, in terms of the treatment highlights, these are characteristics that I think really make this an interesting study, at least from my point of view. First of all, we've created these math and CTE teacher teams. Now, these math teachers are not coaches, but rather they're actual participating members of the team. And there has been a very rich flow back and forth between the occupational CTE teachers and the math teachers. One of the, in any study of this kind, there's a great deal of what I would call serendipitous findings. One of the things that we have noticed and actually have been collecting sort of stories on, if you will, are math teachers who are saying things like, gee, can I use that curriculum that we've created for your class over here in my math class because it's really interesting and I think it will grab the kids' attention. And so it is a rich back and forth. The professional development is done jointly with the math teachers and the career tech ed teachers, and then we have this ongoing collaboration. The model is designed such that prior to the enhancement being delivered, being taught, and by the way, these enhancements may take place in a day, they may take place over a couple of days, they may be embedded into particular projects that spread over a period of weeks. That depends on what they designed that they thought would fit best in their particular situation. But this ongoing collaboration with the CTE and math teachers is a rich part of this study. So they meet prior to the enhancements being delivered, and then they meet afterwards to sort of debrief what went well, what do they need to fix. We've done a fair amount of revision on a number of these enhancements from our pilot in the spring. The treatment itself we define as having three components. There's the math enhancement process itself, which has 7 elements. I'll briefly introduce them to you. There's the professional development component, which is in 3 parts. We're actually in the middle of the second set of professional developments right now. And then, as I mentioned earlier, this ongoing direct and indirect math support. In terms of the enhancement, we began by having the students, having the teachers make explicit what it is we're doing. And crucial to this is helping the students understand that this is not a math lesson. This is not what we're doing. This is that oil and water infusion metaphor, if I could go back to that. But rather, this is using math as a tool to solve a problem in the occupational setting. A second piece of it is what we call bridging. And this is where we move back and forth between the vocabulary of the workplace and the vocabulary of math. That's slope. That's pitch on a roof. Going back to Calvin to illustrate how difficult this is, gee, what's a peck? A quick smooch. And as Calvin says, you know, I don't understand math at all. And I think that highlights the problem. If you look at the work of Gene Lave and Lauren Resnick and others, what they discovered is that people had competency in math skills outside of the classroom, but when you brought them back into the classroom, they didn't understand the vocabulary, they didn't understand the symbols, they didn't understand the written mathematics, even though they could do it when they were out in what we might refer to as the real world. And so part of this process is helping students bridge between the occupational language and the language of math. Other components, and these are not linear, by the way, I have to emphasize that. But we began really with what we would call the embedded example, the one that flows naturally from the curriculum. If you're building a hog barn, as we're doing in one of our projects, then you have to pour concrete. In order to pour the concrete, you need to use some basic algebra to compute how much concrete you need. And moving back and forth between what I like to call the concrete example, the actual embedded example, to the math language, showing the students how that looks if it's actually a formula as opposed to the sort of shorthand that might be used in the workplace. Then we move out a step, if you will, and we talk about the same kind of problem, but give students an opportunity to take that notion, but give them different numbers, not the ones they're working with, but in that same context, that same general idea, give them another set of numbers to play with. And then finally, we move them, and I sort of think of this as successive approximations, we move them out to showing them what that same kind of problem looks like in a more traditional math setting, if you will, or a more traditional math problem. And I know in some of our sites they're actually using questions from state exams to show them, so that the student can see not only through the language, not only through the bridging language, but also see literally starting with the activity in the classroom that particular roof project, that particular auto tech thing they were working on, actually has a counterpart out here in this other setting, this new, this novel, this different setting. We provide for opportunities for students to demonstrate their understanding, and then finally through formal assessment in several ways. We are looking to see that teachers include these questions on their regular examination. If they do 6-week exams or semester exams, do they include questions about mathematics that they've covered during that time on those exams? So that's sort of the process. Our timeline for the study, as I mentioned, we're midway through it now. We started with professional development in the summer. We're in the second series. In between those professional development sessions where we focus on about the next 10 or 12 weeks, we have the teachers come together with their math partners, and they sort of hammer on the math that they might be feeling uncomfortable with, so that they're comfortable with it when they're working with their students. Because again, what's critical for this, and by the way, teamwork really does matter. Those are my dogs, that's my cat, and that's my beer. Cat's no longer with us, but she was a good pet. The key to all of this is helping the students bridge between the world and language of the vocabulary of the workplace, of the occupation, of the career tech ed program, to the world and language of mathematics. What have we learned? I want to share with you now some very preliminary data, and I will emphasize this multiple times. We are still in the analysis process. We have preliminary data from our pilot. Now I want to emphasize a couple of things. One is that the pilot was for a single semester this past spring, and that in our process of implementation, we discovered some things that we needed to take care of, some issues, if you will, in terms of implementation that we resolved for this year's study. So it's a short intervention, but we do have some classroom level achievement data and also student level achievement data and occupational skill achievement data, because again, we want to be able to do this without reducing technical skill development. Again, preliminary analysis, I'll continue to emphasize that. When we look across all of the sites, one of the things that we noticed was that on our three measures of math, the Terra Novas, the AccuPlacer, and WorkKeys, all were positive, but the AccuPlacer scores were significantly different for the experimental kids than for the students in the control class. Now keep in mind, this is the test that is used by a lot of community colleges as a placement exam to determine where you start your program. Do you start in remedial math, or do you go right into regular college math? And we did find that across all sites there was a significant difference after what was a relatively short intervention of one semester. When we look at the different sites, we had, again, 6 in the pilot. We found that in 2 of the sites, they were giving us, if you will, the hit on AccuPlacer. That's Site 2 and Site 5. That the 3 tests across the other sites were, for the most part, positive, but you do see in 3 of the tests, in 2 of the sites, they were actually negative, or the control students actually scored higher than the experimental students. But what's important to keep in mind is even though the score looks different, these are not statistically significant. So 2 of the sites, we did find a hit, if you will, on AccuPlacer scores. When we look again at across the sites, and now we toss in controls, as we begin to build a more complex analytic model, we find that in the findings change a little bit. And we find that in one site, we actually have the Career Tech Ed experimental students scoring higher on Terra Nova, and in another site, the students are scoring higher on WorkKeys. Again, these are preliminary data, and we have a more complex analysis that we'll be subjecting these data to. Now, that important question, can we do this? Can we mix oil and water? Can we do this without affecting technical skill development? And we had a surprising finding. Across the 6 sites, 2 of them, students in the experimental group scored significantly higher on the technical or content tests for their areas than did the students in the control group. I've expressed surprise at this finding to a number of people who've told me that why would I be surprised? Because if in fact math is needed in the workplace, one would expect that increasing math skills would show up when you look at the skills that students express through their occupational either skills or content area exams. So again, this was a surprising and very interesting finding. Some caveats. At this stage, what we're looking at are global measures of math. That is to say that these are tests of math that are geared to age or grade levels, depending on which test we're using. So this is testing all their math. The enhancements focus only on some math. So it's important to keep that in mind. We do know from our spring data that there was a great deal of variability in terms of how the teachers implemented, which we've corrected for this year. And we know that some of the control schools were engaged in some whole school math reforms that were affecting their students. Now, the math framework that we're using has these 10 categories, and on 2 of the tests, Terra Nova and AccuPlacer, you can see which of those tests test which of those particular constructs. So as you can see, Terra Nova and AccuPlacer in some cases tests some of the same. In some cases, one will test this and the other will not. AccuPlacer tends to be more algebra focused, and they have a whole separate category of algebraic expressions. We don't have work keys breakdowns at this point. We're still working with them to obtain them. When we look at AccuPlacer, again, we found some interesting findings previously. When we look now within AccuPlacer at those different areas that they actually measure, what we find is that the category of patterns, functions, and algebra, the experimental students did significantly better than did the students in the control groups. But on 3 of the other 5 measures, the experimental students had more positive scores, but again, not statistically significantly different. And when we take that patterns, functions, and algebra apart, what we find is that the areas that they did best on within that are equations and using algebra to solve problems. So as we continue to sort of drill down in our numbers and try to understand what's going on within these different areas, our next step is to link these to the actual enhancements to see the relationship between what was the focus of the instruction and where we actually had differences in terms of test scores. On the Terra Nova, we had an interesting finding. The control, we look at the units or the areas that the Terra Nova tested. One of them was significantly different, significantly higher than on the experimental side. Although, again, you can see the plus signs indicating where the differences were, but again, they were not significantly different. And when we drill down in that one, what we find is that the control students did better on solving non-routine problems and proportional reasoning. Now again, this is aggregating data from across all 6 sites. We'll be moving into a site-by-site analysis next. So, what are the possible explanations for what we found? One explanation is that the replications that more closely followed the experimental model that we designed may be the ones that showed the significant math score gains. This is part of our future analysis. Another possibility is that the CTE curriculum that was more or less rich may have had an effect. We know that there is different kinds of math and different amounts of math that is available to tap into across these different curricular areas. Or it may be another Calvin factor. Given that sooner or later we're all just going to die, what's the point of learning about integers? Calvin may be out there again. Class, turn to page 83. Nobody likes us big picture people. Well, I don't know if that's the explanation, but we'll certainly explore that too. This is just a quick peek at some of the major players in this project. I'm joined by Dr. Lewis on this project, Dr. Alfeld back at the University of Minnesota, Dr. Donna Pearson, a number of folks from our partner institutions, Dennis Scanlon from Penn State, Craig Edwards from Oklahoma State, as well as Mary Kisner, Sue Jensen, Mary Fudge. We bring math experts, we bring CTE experts, and in some cases, these folks have expertise in both areas. Our timeline is displayed here. We will be finished with this part of the study. We'll do our final testing in May and June, analysis over the summer. We hope to have final results about this time next year for the full year implementation. I'll leave you with this thought for the day. Most smiles are started by another smile. So with that, I will end my presentation, and I see we have some questions coming in, and I'll try to deal with those as best I can. If you have specific questions about this study, my email is displayed on the screen. Feel free to send me a note if we don't get your question answered today.
Thank you very much, Jim, for a most interesting presentation of a very wide-ranging and critical study for the advancement of academic education in the context of CTE. Jim, the questions that have come in range from some that are very specific, and I'm sure you can easily answer. In the scope and sequence planning grid, for example, what do the numbers under the state columns refer to?
Let me look at that slide. Those are simply codes for the lesson plan. So if you're looking at Colorado, where we had our business and marketing replication, you have a number like B18, which begins to sound a bit like bingo, but it's not. That's simply a designator so that we can track that particular lesson. The number in parentheses indicates the number of teachers who are teaching that lesson that week. Recall that I said that not all teachers will teach the same lesson at the same time. But over the course of the study, all teachers will teach all the lessons or all the enhancements. So this allows us to track that. So it's just simply a coding scheme.
Okay. And Jim, this is one that refers to the slide which compared the 6 different sites on the significant differences. Why is site 3 negative on Terra Nova not statistically significant, even though it has a wider margin than the statistically significant positive differences?
Okay, well, you need to sign up for my research class. And the most simple answer I can give, and I'll try to be concise, it means that there's a great deal of variability on both the control side and the experimental side, such that even though there appears to be a great deal of difference, as indicated by that bar, from a statistical point of view, we cannot say with any confidence that the difference is greater than 0. Boy, I hope that made sense.
Okay. Did to me.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Could you give us some examples of embedded math in CTE content?
Oh, I wish I had Donna Pearson here. Perhaps, Morgan, let me turn. You've been a lot closer to some of that than I have.
Okay, yeah. Well, from our review of the lesson plans which have been submitted in Pennsylvania, in Autotech, for example, there's some very interesting mathematical concepts which underlie questions related to displacement in an engine. How much cylinder displacement is there, and then how do you calculate that? You quickly get into geometry and determining the volume of a cylinder. If you want to adjust that in any way, what are the implications for the various parts of the formula for the volume of a cylinder? Similar questions with regard to the example Jim gave on concrete. You need for a barn number of cubic feet or cubic yards, and if you have to make translations between measurements in feet and yards, and what are the necessary conversions, the ratios of feet to yards, and so on. So those are some of the examples. And in Autotech, for example, they get into Ohm's law, Watt's law, things which I had probably studied back in my basic physics class, but really had not encountered until I began reviewing these lessons again. Jim, how about some examples of excellent successful integration of math, or is this the first time that this concept has been tried?
As I mentioned earlier in one of the slides, folks have been taking a shot at integrating math and career tech ed in a number of ways, everything from the applied math classes to others. We don't know from a research point of view or a research evaluation point of view the extent to which they worked or didn't work. What this study is doing is testing one approach. As I mentioned, there are these other approaches, and there are perhaps others yet that I don't know about that are being implemented across the United States that have not been tested. But this is one that we developed working with folks from the National Science Foundation's math work or math projects and other experts in math, and we put together an approach to taking this embedded math and working with it that we thought would be effective. And so we've created an intervention, and in the best spirit of the language of No Child Left Behind and evidence-based science, what we are doing is testing an intervention, testing an approach to improving math skills. And we'll know something about this when we're done. We won't know anything about the others, and they certainly can be tested in somewhat the same way, I'm sure, although again, the project of this kind is quite complicated and actually quite expensive. But so that when we're all done, we'll be able to say something about this approach. We will not be able to say anything about the other approaches, whether they're good, bad, or indifferent.
Okay. What are the major problems you've encountered in implementing the study?
How much time do we have? Boy. Well, let me begin with the positive side. I have been overwhelmed by the degree of support from virtually all corners in terms of getting this project off the ground, getting support and help from people within states as well as people who are in these various national organizations that I showed you a slide on early in the presentation. And I've been really impressed with the willingness of teachers, grizzled veterans, who are willing to change the way they teach so that they can benefit their kids. When I started this project, among many things I was told is that they won't do it. You know, they've had that lesson plan for 20 years and it's worked good till then, and by golly, they're going to retire in 5 or 10 more, and why should they change now? So the outpouring of interest, the continued dedication of these teachers has just been awesome. We have had difficulties in, some of it is just because of the magnitude of the study. This is a large study. Unlike other experimental studies where you're dealing with a single classroom and you got a little group of kids in this corner, a little group in this corner, we have over 3,000 students spread across, I think, 9 states, working with upwards of 150 teachers and over 100 school districts. So the complexity of it and managing the different needs of different school districts in terms of information, that has been daunting. The degree of minutia that comes with a study like this, and we could tell you stories, has been quite a bit, quite overwhelming, in fact, at times. Lots of little operational things, unanticipated kinds of situations. In the original design of the study, we wanted to pay the teachers and pay the students because they're doing work for us. We wanted the kids to actively participate, so we have small rewards each time they take a set of tests. Well, we discovered in some school districts they wouldn't let us do that. And in a design of this sort, we have to ensure that all testing conditions remain the same within each of those replications. So whenever we had to make a change to accommodate one school district, we'd have to make sure that that same change we did in the entire replication. And that wasn't always easy. In other cases, we had school districts who refused to let us pay their teachers, despite the fact they were coming in on their own time, they were coming in the summer, they were working on weekends, they stayed after school to do this stuff, they came to the meetings. So we had to resolve some of those kinds of issues. Boy, I could go on for quite a while, but I think that if I were to sum it all up, the difficulties we've had, I think, are simply because of the magnitude of the study. We felt that we needed to do something of sufficient consequence such that when we were done, we could say with some confidence, you know, if it worked in these 5, we got a pretty good shot at working across the different occupational areas. So you see we have different kinds of occupational areas, or SLMPs, as well as very different kinds of students in very different kinds of geographic locations.
Okay. On the basis of your experience to date, do you have any advice you could give to a principal or career center director who is trying to improve the math skills of his or her students? I hesitate to answer the question because we're in the middle of a study, and I will feel much more confident about recommendations when we have concluded our study and really have some time to spend with the data. At this point, we have been so busy. We started this study initially as a single-year study that was condensed to a semester because of some timing issues, and then partway through that process, we negotiated an agreement to implement a full year of study, which is what we had initially intended to do. And as a consequence, as we were then winding down the pilot, we were ramping up the year-long intervention, and we have been just running, and we have not had enough time. Donna and Morgan, Corrine, and all the other folks involved in this study, we have not had enough time to really come to understand not just the quantitative data, the test scores, that's only a piece of it, but we have mountains of videotapes, of teachers teaching, of observations forms that we've had filled out.
we have a mountain of other data that we need to really understand before I'm comfortable making specific recommendations. I suppose if there's one thing I could say with some confidence at this point, that it does seem that you can do this kind of thing and still maintain the integrity of the career tech ed content. And that was an abiding principle in this study. We went into this saying that, well, if we can increase the math scores over here by 2 points, but we lose it on the technical skill development side, we're not sure, and I'm still not sure that that would be a good trade. So the findings that not only was there no difference in 4 of the sites on the occupational skills test, but in fact in 2 of the sites they were statistically significant and quite large findings in the positive direction, to me are quite encouraging. So at this point I feel almost giddy about that part of it.
Very good. Do you have any plans for follow-up studies or expansion of the program after the final findings are assessed?
Well, I have ideas. The study is funded through the U.S. Department of Education Office of Vocational and Adult Education. Our centers are funded through Perkins. We have a 1-year extension, as many of you may know, because of the delay in reauthorization. However, our center is set to close at the conclusion of the study. Assuming there's another center, assuming that we're some part of it, I certainly would like to extend this into the area of science and more general literacy skills. I think we could find interesting other opportunities to explore how we can take this thing that we've got the kids. We've got them hooked on this. They're in there. We've got them in their 11th and 12th grade. We've got them before they leave the last vestiges of traditional public education. And I get back to my moral obligation for what we do. What we do is prepare them to be successful in these different occupational arenas, or be prepared to move out and get more education to be successful in these areas. And it's increasingly important that they have grounding in numeracy, that they have grounding in written, spoken English, and they can write, and that indeed they can read. And I think these are all components of elements that we can look at and how they might play out in the context of a career tech ed curriculum.
Well, thank you very much, Jim, for a very interesting presentation. I think all of us in career and technical education have always felt that the pedagogy of career and technical education has an awful lot to offer to education in general. And we're very pleased to be involved in one of the major experimental studies, as large as any that I'm aware of, and as rigorous as any that I'm aware of, that's ever been conducted to really test in a scientific way. We invite you to, those of you viewing this webcast, to join us for the next in the series, which will be 1 week from tomorrow on November 30th at our usual time. The topic will be next steps in technical skill assessment, and we will have a panel that will include John Foster, the Vice President of the National Association of State Directors of Career and Technical Education, Stanley Rabinowitz, Director of Assessment and Standards Development Services with WestEd, and Mary Shumway, who is the State Career and Technical Education Director for the Utah Office of Education. Thank you for joining us, and we hope that you will join us again 1 week from tomorrow, Tuesday, for our next webcast. Thank you.